That's what's happening in my workplace. And speaking of workplace, let's jump in. Welcome to week 2 of Sticking It to the Man. This series is actually a response to a message that we preached a few months ago. If you remember, it was called Love Where You Work. And we had so many people say, man, I needed to hear that we decided to do a whole series jumping into the workplace. Now, if we're honest, one of the hardest places to be holy, one of the hardest places to live out your faith is in your workplace, right? Now, how many of you sometimes wish you had a different job? Safe space, you can raise your hand. I won't tell your boss, okay? I mean, it's hard to find that right job, that perfect job, isn't it? I wanted you to know that if you felt like that, if you've ever been frustrated at work, you're not alone. In fact, I thought it'd be helpful for you to hear somebody else's job woes. And so I won't share any name to protect identity, but listen to this guy's story. He says, my first job was working in an orange juice factory, but I got canned because I couldn't concentrate. Now, don't worry, they get much worse. He said, I worked as a lumberjack for a while, but I couldn't hack it, so they gave me the axe. After that, I tried to be a tailor, but I wasn't suited for it. Next, I tried working in a muffler plant, but that job was exhausting. I wanted to be a barber, but I just couldn't cut it. I attempted to work at Subway, but any way you slice it, I couldn't cut the mustard. I thought about going to school to be a doctor, but I didn't have enough what? Yeah, patience. You're real smart, yeah. Finally, I got a job working for a plumber, but that job was draining. Yeah, it was draining. And now currently I'm working as a historian. It's fine as far as jobs go, but I don't think there's any future in it. Ba-doom, ching, and we're done. That was stupid, but that was fun. Now, when it comes to the topic of work, there's a lot we can learn. And there's a lot that we can learn, particularly from the book of Nehemiah. So turn with me to Nehemiah chapter 3. If you're using one of our Bibles, we'll be on page 290. If you didn't bring your Bible, just slip your hand up. The ushers will bring you one, and you can follow along. If you don't own a Bible, please raise your hand, and we'll just keep it. Just keep this. We'll give it to you as a gift. Nehemiah 3, page 290. If you have peeked ahead, if you've read Nehemiah before, or if in anticipation of this series you were looking, you probably realize that Nehemiah chapter 3 seems like, at first glance, one of those places in the Bible that you're tempted to skip over because it's just a big list of unpronounceable names, right? You know what I'm talking about? And let's get to the good stuff, right? Well, if you do, you'll have missed some great lessons. There's a lot of interesting things in this chapter, and so I want to talk to you out of this chapter about what it means to work well with others. Now, in a quick review of our series, Love Where You Work, we talked about how for a lot of people, half of what makes their work hard is not the actual job they do, it's the people that they work with. It's not that people hate their job, they hate their work environment. And so if we can learn anything from Nehemiah about how to be better in our work environment, that'll be good stuff. So to set us up, give you a little historical context of what's going on, in 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army came in, they captured the Jews, Jerusalem is destroyed, the walls of the city are knocked down, the temple is burned, the Jews are deported, and they're forced into slavery, and everything stays this way for 70 years. This story is picking up after that when it's time to rebuild the city, and this is a story of Nehemiah's call to lead, his preparations for leadership, and what for years, how he in 52 days did what for years had remained unfinished. So in chapter 1, we talk about Nehemiah's call. Chapter 2 talks about how Nehemiah starts sharing his plan with everybody. And in chapter 3, it's the beginning of this great work to rebuild the walls of the city. So that's where we're going. Now, have you ever tried to work with and organize large groups of people? It's terrible. It's like trying to herd cats, right? You can't do it. And so what's happening here is, in fact, there's a saying that applies to large groups, particularly when you think about meetings. It's this saying: none of us is as dumb as all of us. None of us is as dumb as all of us, meaning there's something that happens in large groups. Intelligent people who can make good decisions in large groups become a mindless mass of humanity, right? Take, for example, Disney World or Disneyland. Anybody been? Disney World, Disneyland? You go in with a plan. When you're in the parking lot, you've got it all figured out. Here's how I'm going to avoid the crowds. Here's how I'm not going to stand in line too long. Here's how I'm going to save a bunch of money. I got snacks in the cooler, right? About 2 or 3 hours in, you realize you just spent $87 on like 2 hot dogs and a slushie, and you're in line for It's a Small World again. And you're like, how did this happen? I don't understand. Because we lose our minds in large groups. Nowhere is this more true than in the workplace. And so in chapter 3, it reveals Nehemiah's amazing gift for mobilizing and organizing a workforce. This guy empowered 44 separate groups of people around one task. Do you know how impossible that is? 44 groups of people around one task to rebuild these walls. Now here's a picture of, there were 45 sections of this wall. There were 10 different gates. Some of these areas needed repair, others needed to be completely rebuilt, and somehow Nehemiah brings them all together. This is an incredible feat of organization. Commentator Matthew Henry puts it this way. He says, the work was divided, the work that Nehemiah was doing was divided so that everyone might know what he had to do and mind it with a desire to excel, yet without contention or separate interests. Let me translate that. They worked well together. Like everybody did their job, nobody complained, everybody wanted to do a good job, and they didn't fight. Like that's a miracle, okay? So with that background, we're going to ask Nehemiah, we're going to look into Nehemiah and go, how can we answer the question, what does it take to work well with others? So let's jump into the text, Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 1. It says, then Eliashab the high priest and the other priests started to rebuild at the sheep gate. They dedicated it and set up its doors, building the wall as far as the Tower of the 100, which they dedicated, and the Tower of Hananel. You might be like, what does that have to do with anything? Well, let's start out. Number one, begin by putting God first. Begin by putting God first. It says they started at the sheep gate. Okay, that's meaningless to us in our context, but in their context, it was very clear. There was no accident. It was another way of saying we're going to put God first, because what you need to understand, the sheep gate was in the northeast corner of the city. It provided easy access to the temple, and it was given its name because all of the sheep that entered were on their way to be sacrificed at the temple. They were pure, spotless lambs on their way to be sacrificed at the temple. So by starting here, Nehemiah is making a statement. God, you're our first priority in this entire project. You're first in all we do. And by the way, that's how it should be at your workplace. Listen, God, I don't know what you do for work. God is not impressed with your labor. Okay? In other words, he's not nearly as interested in what you do for work or how you work as in why you work. Let me rephrase that. Before you enter your workplace on Monday morning, what are you doing to dedicate your heart to God? What are you doing Monday through Friday? Typically people, we go to church on Sunday, we do the church thing, but Monday through Friday, that's work, man, that's different. What are you doing each morning to prepare yourself to bring Christ into the workplace, to prepare yourself to work for Christ? What are you doing to prepare yourself? We so often focus on what we do that we forget who we're doing it for. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 23, it says this, work willingly at whatever you do, whatever your job is, work willingly at whatever you do as though you were working for who? For the Lord rather than for people. Did you know, as a pastor, I'm not the only one who works for God. Everyone who has a job in this room works for the Lord. That's who you work for. And worship must always precede work. So how do you start your day? These guys are building walls. They're not like, they're not doing church work. They're building walls. And they're starting their day by saying, God, we do this for you. We do this for you. So wherever you work, whatever your job is, we should start first with God. We have to be dedicated to God before we can do anything of value for God. Does that make sense? And so the spiritual leaders lead the way, which points to the second thought I want to share with you today. Leaders must set the example. If we want to work well with others, it starts with great leadership. Leaders must set the example. Let's look at Nehemiah 3, look at verse 1 again, and then verse 2. So you have then Eliashab, the high priest, and the other priests started to rebuild the sheep gate. The leaders started. They dedicated it and set up its doors, building the wall as far as the Tower of the 100, which they dedicated, and the Tower of Hananel. People from the town of Jericho worked next to them, and beyond them was Zachar, son of Emri. So what you have here is the leaders led, and the people began to follow. The spiritual leaders jump right in, and they lead by example. Whatever work environment you're talking about, attitude reflects leadership. Leaders set the pace, and leaders set the example. And teamwork starts with great leadership. If you want others to come alongside and work with you, leadership, you have to understand, leadership is not telling other people what to do. Leadership is casting vision for what needs to be done and then being first to dive in and do it, to lead by example. And when that's lacking in your workplace, when leadership is lacking in your workplace, guess what? Motivation lacks too. And if you're wondering, our workplace seems pretty demotivated. Is leadership lacking? Listen for key phrases among the workers. Phrases like, I'm overworked, or I feel burnt out. You ever hear that at work? I'm just so burnt out with this job. I tell our staff, burnout isn't a result of too much work. It's a result of too little vision. In other words, burnout is not a result of having too much to do. It's a result of forgetting why we do what we do. It's the leader's job to cast vision and then to lead by example in chasing that vision. The greatest example of this, of course, was Jesus. John chapter 13, there's this amazing story that illustrates Jesus is in a small room on the top floor of a house. His whole leadership team is there, right? His 12 that he's going to send out in the world to carry out his work on earth. And the custom of the day was before they shared a meal together to have a servant wash their feet, but there was no servant, and nobody wanted to wash feet. So Jesus, the leader, takes off his outer cloak, puts a towel around himself, goes to each disciple with a basin of water, and he washes their feet. And then he says something profound. As the leader, he says something profound. In John 13, verse 13 to 15, he said, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, because that's what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I've set you an example to follow. Do as I have done." That's key. He says, I've given you the example because teamwork starts with a great example, with great leadership. Now, I know there are some of you sitting in this room right now going, I wish my boss was listening to this, right? Before you let yourself off the hook and point the finger at your boss, please hear this. You don't have to be in leadership to lead. You don't have to be in a position of leadership. You don't have to be in a position at all. Think about your workplace. Even if your workplace is your home or raising your children, whatever, think about your workplace. It doesn't matter if you're the boss or not. Where is the place in your workplace that you could lead simply by bringing your best to your job when nobody else is? Where is the place in your workplace that you could lead by not cheating the company out of time, or by only speaking good things about your boss, or by giving 100% to whatever you do, whatever the management asks you to do, or by casting the vision of your company and actually living it out, or by showing up on time, or by not skipping out early? Leaders set the example, so be one, even if you don't have the position to back it up. Because leaders lead. And number 3, and this one's really profound, so get ready. Working well with others means you work well with others. It took me a long time to come up with that one. Here's what I mean. Working well with others means you actually work well with others. Verse 8. Next was Uzziel, son of Harhaiah, a goldsmith by trade, who also worked on the wall. Beyond him was Hananiah, a manufacturer of perfumes. They left out a section of Jerusalem as they built the broad wall. Here's the point. We have to actually work with others. We all have a part to play. Here they are, the rebuilding of the city walls. It was not reserved only for the contractors. It doesn't say they brought in a contracting company and then the contractors did all the work. This job was kind of like all hands on deck. From the spiritual leaders, the priests who led the way, to now goldsmiths and perfume makers. Everyone has a part to play in the project, which points out an important New Testament principle. The ministry of the church belongs to everyone in the church. It doesn't just belong to the pastoral staff, it belongs to everyone. It's why we continually are calling people to get involved and serve and get in a life group and do all these things. We can't do all God called us to do if you aren't doing your part. And the same concept applies in your workplace, whatever your workplace is. One of the single greatest factors today to raise morale in the workplace, you know what it is? Ownership. Employees want to know that they're not just a cog in the wheel. They want to know that what they're doing matters and that they're doing their part to make a difference in the bigger picture. Now, I want you to note something, because a lot of people get tripped up with this. Not everyone is in their specialty all the time, okay? We got goldsmiths and perfume makers who were both working to rebuild walls. That's not their job. That's not their specialty. They didn't know anything about building walls. But you know what they did know? That the walls needed to be built. Here's my point. God didn't need 1,000 carpenters. He needed ordinary people willing to do what it takes. Think about your job right now. Again, whatever position, even if you're lowest man on the totem pole, think about your job right now. What would make your workplace better? Tomorrow, go do that. Go do that. The greatest excuse that you hear in the workplace over and over, people complain about their work, they complain about all these different things, that if only this were different, I would do this differently. And then when you say to them, well, why don't you do something about it? Because they say, that's not my job. It's not my job, so it's not my problem. And I would say, I disagree. You work there, so whatever your job is, you're part of something bigger. You're part of making this thing great. And yet, according to Richard Huseman in his book, Managing the Equity Factor, when surveyed, 85% of workers in the United States say they could work harder on their job. They don't give 100%. Over 50% say they could double their effectiveness if they wanted to, but they just don't feel like it. Are you kidding me? So the question is, what kind of worker am I? What kind of worker are you? Are you willing to work well with others, doing whatever it takes to get the job done? What we see in Nehemiah is all through this passage the same phrase over and over. It's the phrase next to him. He was working, and next to him, and then next to him. Over 25 times we hear this phrase. You have 44 separate groups of people actually working together side by side for one cause. How would it revolutionize your workplace if that's the kind of worker that you chose to become? And by the way, the same is true in God's kingdom. Did you know God doesn't need trained professionals in order to build his church? In fact, all he needs is ordinary people willing to work. People who so believe in the vision of their local church, they'll do anything it takes, willing to let God use them. Let me give you some examples. Maybe working in the nursery does not sound like fun to you. It's not your thing. But you know what? Maybe is people finding Jesus your thing? And maybe people finding Jesus because they're not distracted by their kids matters. And so even though you don't love it, guess what you do? You work in the nursery so they can hear about Jesus. Maybe working in guest services does not sound like fun to you. I don't want to make coffee. I don't want to greet people. But maybe knowing people feel welcomed and loved so that they're comfortable when they come back, maybe that does matter to you. And so even though it wouldn't be your thing, you serve in guest services. See, sometimes God uses us to serve through our giftedness, and sometimes we serve just because there's a need and someone has to do it, and so we jump in. And at the Ransom, our vision is setting captives free. We have this crazy idea, this desire to continue to reach more people for Jesus, as many people for Jesus as we possibly can. I will unapologetically stand before you and say, I want to reach as many people for Jesus as possible. Guess what that takes? It takes more space. It takes people going to South Campus and to Future West Campus. It takes people from Sunday morning saying, you know what, I wouldn't prefer this, but I'll go to Saturday night because it's full here and we need to make room for people to come on Sunday morning. It takes inviting people. It takes all of these things. Guess what else it takes? It takes more volunteers, more leaders, more nursery workers, more guest service members, more musicians, more people willing to, like I said, go to South Campus or go to Saturday night or whatever. And it's easy to say, well, that's not my thing. That's not for me. That's not my gifting. I really don't, I'll leave that to someone else. That's not my job, so it's not my problem. And I would say I disagree. If you call this your church, it is your problem. And no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. We can all serve or give or go or pray. We all have a part to play, amen? But then there's a reality that we need to look at. Number 4, embrace the reality of inequity. Or let me say that another way. Think about your workplace again, right? Some people just work harder than others. Is that fair? Some people do all the work. Some people don't do any work at all. There's a job for everyone. There's something for everyone to do, but some simply refuse to carry their share of the load. You ever work with anybody like that? Look at verse 5 of Nehemiah chapter 3. Next were the people from Tekoa, though their leadership refused to work with the construction supervisors. Now, Tekoa is about 11 miles from Jerusalem. So this is Jerusalem's neighbor coming in to lend their hand. But even though a lot of people from Tekoa made the commute, the nobles, the leadership, they called in sick. Literally, they refused to participate in God's work because they didn't want to have to follow orders. They were too important to get their hands dirty. They were too proud to submit themselves. The phrase refused to work here literally could be translated, they would not put their shoulder to the work. By the way, you ever see that in your workplace? You got anybody in your workplace who just never does their fair share? They'll do anything to be lazy. I can't speak to your workplace, but you ever see that in church? Of course you do. I wonder if there's anyone here who isn't in a life group. And the reason that you're not in a life group, if you're honest with yourself, is it's inconvenient. It's like another night, and I got to get my kids somewhere. But you're just not in one because it's inconvenient. I wonder how many people don't serve right now because our expectation is we would like you to attend one service and serve another service. And I'm not very good at math, but that's 2 hours, okay? And people all the time say, that's just too much. Now, forget the fact that we'll give tons of time to our hobby or our favorite TV show or even our workplace, but 2 hours, man, that just seems unrealistic. I wonder how many people see the need for volunteers or people to go to South Campus or people to go to Saturday night, but we don't, and the reason we don't is because we don't want to, I don't want to do that. I don't feel like that, right? If that's where you're at, you're missing out. You're missing out. Serving in God's kingdom is one of the greatest privileges of all time. Nothing is more rewarding than kingdom work. Some of the happiest Christians I know are those who are literally just pouring their lives out in service, and some of the grumpiest Christians I know are those who are not willing to put their shoulder to the work, if you know what I mean. Now, that's not to say shame on anybody or anything like that. Every church has that inequity, and you've got those who just don't want to do anything, and you got those who do the lion's share. Let me speak to those who do like double duty and the lion's share. Let me talk to you for a second. If you're here serving at the church and man, you help Saturday and Sunday and you're doing the lion's share, let me ask you a question. Do you bring that same attitude with you to work on Monday? Because here's what's interesting to me. Some of the people who are like the best volunteers on Saturday and Sunday have the crappiest attitudes at work on Monday. And doesn't that just seem inconsistent? What would happen if we brought this into the workplace and said, the way that I serve here, I'm going to serve here because it's all kingdom work. It's all kingdom work. In verse 27 of Nehemiah 3, it says, Then came the people of Tekoa who repaired another section across from the great projecting tower and over to the wall of Ophel. I want you to note this. The greatest work here is the greatest work was done by ordinary people. Not by the management, not by the leadership. These people refused to follow their leader's bad example, and they came anyway, and these are the ones who were willing to go the extra mile. These are the volunteers. These are the workers that our workforce needs in this world. These are the workers who show up. Bosses, imagine how your life would be different if you had employees who came and they said, I'm done with the work you gave me. What do you have next? Rather than saying, what's the least I can do and still get a paycheck? See, most of us approach volunteerism and we approach work as if it's something I have to do. It's a duty. I have to get it done. So what do? We show up last minute. We watch the clock like the whole time. As soon as our time's up, we hit that punch card, right? And then I'm done. I'm off duty. But working and serving is not a duty. It's a privilege. And not everybody even has it. And yet some of us, it's just really easy, isn't it, to take your job for granted? I do it. I have one of the best jobs in the world. I take it for granted. Now, I want you to, as I was studying this chapter, I noticed an interesting pattern in these verses. Many of the workers were repairing the walls right in front of their own houses. Over and over, you see the phrase, across from his house. And across from his house, he worked on the wall here, and then this guy across from his house. I think there's 2 key things to note there. First, God has placed you where he wants you to be. We are, without question, strategically located in our neighborhood, in our job, in our home, in our school, amongst our friends. God's placed us there, and that's our mission field. And he's also given us certain gifts to use, spiritual gifts to use. And that's a beautiful thing. And a lot of people go, well, I should use those spiritual gifts in the church. And that's true. But you should also use those spiritual gifts at your work and in your neighborhood. How would your work, how would your neighborhood change if you began to pour out your spiritual gifts? It would change everything completely. The second truth I note here is that God can use you wherever you're willing. But you got to be willing. For some reason, when it comes to work, people when they're looking for, how can I work better, they say things to themselves like, well, what is that going to do for me? How is that going to get me ahead in my career? How will this advance me? And if it doesn't fit my wiring, if it doesn't fit my giftedness, if it won't advance me, then I'm not really interested. Just forget it. Now, no one would say that out loud, but isn't that what we do, right? And there's an epidemic culturally of people doing as little as possible in work. And so instead of working to make the company better, regardless of what it requires of me, they're just like, how do I do the minimum? And I know this happens at work because it happens with volunteers. We got volunteer spots. We got people who aren't volunteering, and we can't fill the spots. And I'm not saying that, again, like to shame anybody or anything. I'm just saying, you want to know how to work well with others. Are you willing to be used by God doing wherever, whenever, doing whatever? I don't know if you know this, but very often at our jobs and even at church, there are unpleasant things that need to be done. You have any of those around your workplace? Right? I mentioned that each gate in the city had a name. There was one gate that was named the dung gate. The poop gate, literally the poop gate, right? I don't know why it was named that. I don't want to know why. Can't be good. There's no good reason that it could possibly be named the dung gate. Now, here's my point. Many times we're tempted to avoid unpleasant work, aren't we? Watch what happens in this passage, Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 13 and 14. The valley gate was repaired by the people from Zanoah, led by Hanun. They set up its doors and installed its bolts and bars. They also repaired the 1,500 feet of wall, listen, to the dung gate. And then he stops, right? The dung gate was repaired by Malchijah, son of Rechab, the leader of the Beth-Hakerem district. He rebuilt it, set up its doors, and installed the bolts and bars. Now, I hope you see it. Hanun and his crew, they're working along, they're doing their thing, 1,500 feet of wall until they get where? To the dung gate. And then what does he do? All right, fixing the dung gate, right? And Malchijah has to come in and take over and finish the job, right? Listen, someone needs to fix the dung gate. Let me translate that for you so it's meaningful to you. Someone's got to do the crappy jobs. Right? Everybody wants the jobs that are the fun jobs, the ones that get you ahead in the company, the ones that get you all the glory. Who wants to clean toilets? Who wants to get coffee? Who wants to do the low jobs on the totem pole? Or how about volunteering at church? Who wants to do the unseen things, visit the hospital, the nursing home? Who wants to get involved in safe families and mess up your whole life? Who wants to go on a missions trip to a third world country and be uncomfortable? Who wants to have your life turned upside down like that? And the interesting thing is God is saying to us, are you willing to say, me, God? I'm willing to be that person. I'm willing to be that person. If you want to change your work environment, it starts by changing you. Are you willing to put God first? Are you willing to lead by example, even if you're not in a position of leadership? Are you willing to stop making excuses and stop complaining about what other people don't do and instead just do whatever God asks you to do? Because at the end of the day, working well with others, it's nothing more than just working well, regardless of what other people do. It's not actually about changing your work environment. It's not actually about changing the behavior of others. It's simply about letting God change you. And the question is, are you ready to work? I can't control your work environment. You have the privilege of doing that. It's up to you. But we can give you tons of opportunities here. You can sign up for guest services. You can sign up to go to South Campus. You can stop by the info hub and just say, I need to serve. I don't know what I'm doing. I need to serve. And we have stuff. Like we'll plug you in. But ultimately, what has to change is each of our hearts, right? And so my question to you is, are you ready to work, and not just work, but to work well? Let me pray for you. So Heavenly Father, it's interesting to me how passionate you are about this area. It's strange to me, and yet it shouldn't be. As we look back at creation, you created man, and the first thing you gave him was a job. You let him name the animals, and then you gave him the garden to tend it and to watch over it. First thing you gave us was a job. And given that work is something that comes from you, it goes without saying, it should go without saying, that it's your expectation that we work well. And so I pray that for each and every one of us, from those who work full-time, part-time, in the home, raising children, for those who are the bosses, those who are the employees, whatever the scenario may be, help us to work willingly and wholeheartedly as if we were working for you, God, and not for men. I pray this in your name.